So starting the chapter Genesis 38, start reading with me in verse 1. And it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hira. Judah saw that there was a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Then she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. She bore still another son and named him Shelah. And it was at Chezib that she bore him. I want to stop here and look at a few things for just a moment. In the story of Joseph, that will take up Genesis 37 through Genesis 50. Typically we think of it as Joseph's story. Although we read last week in Genesis chapter 37 that was really about the generations of Jacob. And so this is still kind of Jacob's story, but we're learning about his sons. We learn about Joseph, but we also learn about Judah. Judah was the one who suggested to sell Joseph into slavery. He got that ball rolling, so to speak. And now we take our attention away from Joseph, and he's down in Egypt as this story is being told, and we divert and come to talking about Judah. And for a casual reader, you might think, well, I was just introduced to Joseph, and it seemed to be all about him and his dreams and how his brothers were jealous, but now we're talking about Judah. Why? Well, at the very least, Judah is a very instrumental figure in the rest of this story. And some have even said the main character in this story. It says that Judah departed from his brothers. He went out from the rest of his family. And I think what we are to take from that is that was not a good thing. He should have been with the rest of his family. After all, his family had the promises, the divine promise from God, and they had stuck together so far, but Judah left that. And as Judah leaves that, he gets into trouble. He saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite, and by now, I hope that when you read that someone wants to marry and conceive with a Canaanite, that's not a good thing. It's been mentioned multiple times that is not what God wanted. That's not what Abraham wanted for Isaac, not what Isaac wanted for his children, and probably not what Jacob wanted for his children either. And yet, Judah sees a daughter of a certain Canaanite, and he took her and went into her, and she bore him 3 sons. The 3 sons' names are and Onan and Shelah. And really we don't know much about these 3 sons, but we will learn all that there is to learn about them in these next few verses. Keep reading with me in verse 6 of chapter 38. Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he thought, "I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers." So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. So as I said before, we don't know much about Judah's sons. And what we do know is summed up right here, that and Onan, at the very least, were evil in the sight of the Lord. Was evil, and it doesn't talk about his evil specifically, just that he was evil in the sight of the Lord. But it says that the Lord took his life. Now, nowhere before in Genesis do I recall this kind of language being used, that the Lord took a singular person's life because of their evil. In fact, the only other instance that I can think of it like it in Genesis is when Enoch was taken because he walked with God. He is the opposite of what happens to Ur. Ur is so evil that God intervenes and takes his life, and his life alone, it seems. And so, Judah says to Onan, you need to give your brother an heir. We'll talk more about that concept in a moment. But Onan does not want to do that. He does not want to give his brother an heir. He is selfish. And so he disobeys what seemingly God had commanded, because what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord. And so God took Onan's life as well. And then Shelah is apparently quite a bit younger than his other two brothers, at least not old enough to marry. And so we don't know much about him. But I do want to talk about this concept for a moment, where Judah says to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. Now, as a Bible student, that should ring some bells and say, hey, that kind of provision was in the law of Moses. We see Jesus questioned about it over in Matthew chapter 22, and how there was 7 brothers, and the brother with the first brother had a wife, and then the first brother died, and the second brother took her as a wife, and the second brother died, and on it went until the 7th brother. And their question was, whose wife would it be in the resurrection? But that was part of the law of Moses, that when a person had a wife, and that man died, having borne no children to the woman, then it was the next of kins, whoever that was, be it a brother or maybe a cousin, it was their responsibility to give his brother an heir in Israel, in that family, so that their generation could continue to go on. Now that was in the law of Moses, and yet we're seeing this law, this principle, before the law of Moses. And truly, as we study through Genesis, I've tried to point out that multiple times there are things that seem to be in the law of Moses, but have been commanded before. For example, Abraham was told to go offer a burnt offering. Well, a burnt offering is a type of sacrifice found in the law of Moses. But what I'm getting at here is God directed the patriarchs how to serve him, and maybe in ways that we don't necessarily read. This is one of those examples where we don't read where he directed them to do this, and yet they know to do it. And it makes you wonder how much more that God told Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that they were told to do that we just simply don't have. Two of Judah's sons have died. They have been killed by the Lord. Of course, by the way the text indicates, it doesn't seem that Judah knows or is clued into that it was the Lord who took them because they were evil. Rather, he seems to be paranoid that it's somehow Tamar's fault. He says to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. But he has no intention of giving his last son to Tamar. It says he thought, I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers. So Judah is in denial that he's raised his sons to be evil in the sight of the Lord, and that most likely he himself is evil in the sight of the Lord. He thinks perhaps it's Tamar's fault, and so he's not going to give Tamar Shelah. But rather than telling her that, he deceives her and says, yes, I'm going to do this, but go away and I'll do it later. And he never plans on getting around to doing it. The next section that we have to read here is kind of small on screen, so if you cannot read it on screen, I invite you to follow along in your Bibles. It will be verses 12 through 23. Let's keep reading starting in verse 12. Now after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hilah the Adulamite. It was told to Tamar, behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up and that she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, Here now, let me come into you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, What will you give me that you may come in to me? He said, Therefore I will send you a young goat from the flock. She said, Moreover, will you give me a pledge until you send it? He said, What pledge shall I give you? And she said, Your seal, and your cord, and your staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her, and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and departed, and removed her veil, and put on her widow's garments. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the men of her place, saying, Where is the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim? But they said, There has been no temple prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I did not find her. And furthermore, the men of the place said, There has been no temple prostitute here. Then Judah said, Let her keep them. Otherwise we will become a laughingstock. After all, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her. So, we want to note that Judah's wife dies. It was a considerable time later. But his wife dies, and he completes the time of mourning. But then he's going up to the sheep shearers at Timnah, presumably only to shear his sheep. But he finds trouble once again. It was told to Tamar that Judah was going up, and so she conceived a plan. She saw that Judah had lied to her. Shelah had grown up, and she was not given as a wife, and she says, I have to do something because I need an heir. She had no recourse in this society. That she was a widow, she did not have an heir. There was nothing for her in this society, in this age. And so she conceives a plan. She takes off of her widow's garments and puts on a veil, and she goes out and she meets Judah on the road. And Judah thinks that she is a prostitute, and so he turns aside and he asks her to complete their transaction, so to speak. But she wants something for that. And she says, What will you give me? And he pledges a young goat. But she says, How will I know that you will follow through? Now, I do find this interesting because, of course, we know that it is Tamar. He does not. But Tamar is sitting here saying, How do I know that you're going to follow through with what you promised me? You've lied to me before, is the sense that I get from what Tamar is saying. She doesn't say that directly, but probably what she's thinking. And so Judah gives his seal and his cord and the staff that is in his hand, things that showed his authority, things that gave him authority to make transactions, I believe, and showed his identity. And he says, I'll give you these. I will send a young goat, and then you will give those back. It was collateral almost. And so he gives these to Tamar, and then later, when he sends the young goat, she is not found. And he asks, where is this prostitute that was here earlier? His friend does ask this. And they said, no temple prostitute was here. And so they have no idea where she has gone. And so Judah says, well, just let her keep them. Otherwise, I'm going to bring more shame to myself. Keep reading with me in verse 24. Now it was about 3 months later that Judah was informed, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry. Then Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. It was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, I'm with child by the man to whom these things belong. And she said, please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he did not have relations with her again. So Tamar has become pregnant by her father-in-law Judah. He does not know that. And it is told him that she is pregnant, and so she still had a duty to the family. She still had a responsibility to the family that she could not go and be with other men. That seems to be the case here. And so when they find out that she is pregnant, Judah is incensed. He's upset. He says, bring her out and let her be burned. He wants to kill her for this disloyalty that she has been unfaithful to her family, her dead husband, I suppose you could say. And so he wants her to be killed. And so while she's being brought out, she sends along to Judah. And she says, I'm with child by the man to whom these things belong. And she said, please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these. Now, it was actually 2 weeks ago. I said a week ago earlier. But 2 weeks ago, when I preached on Genesis chapter 37, you'll remember that I brought out what they said to Jacob when they sent Joseph's coat, his tunic, to Jacob, dipped in blood. And in verse 32 of chapter 37, they said, we found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not. And here Tamar is saying, please examine whose signet ring and cords and staff are these. So we have items belonging to a person being examined for the sake of identity, but there's so much more than going on with that. I believe the connection here is that Judah's sin has fallen upon him. What he has done to his father is now being done in a similar fashion to him. He's been deceived. They pulled the wool over their father's eyes using this coat to identify Joseph as dead. And yet, in this case, Judah's own things of identification are being used to identify him as the one in the wrong. The one who went into what he thought was a prostitute by the side of the road. And Judah recognized them. And notice what he says. He says, she is more righteous than I. Does that mean that Tamar was righteous in this case? No, I cannot justify what she did. There's no indication that the Scripture is trying to justify what she did. What she did was sinful. However, Judah is condemning himself to say that even as despicable as what she did, she is more righteous than Judah. More righteous. Not righteous, not in the right, so to speak, not completely faultless, but more righteous than Judah, who despicably lied to his daughter-in-law, told her that she was going to receive Shelah as a husband, and had no intention of following through, but also despicably turned aside to what he thought was a harlot on the side of the road. So Judah recognizes his own folly. It says that he did not have relations with her again. So he recognized his sin, and he seems to have learned from that. Keep reading with me in verse 27. It came about at the time she was giving birth that, behold, there were twins in her womb. Moreover, it took place while she was giving birth. One put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But it came about as he drew back his hand, that, behold, his brother came out. Then she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. So he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. So, when we read this, there are some interesting things, even in this seemingly mundane, seemingly run-of-the-mill story about two twins being born. For one, of course, Judah was the father by his daughter-in-law Tamar. There is that. But notice it says there were twins in her womb. As students of Genesis, I hope that you're picking up, your sensors are picking up on pattern there. Who does that remind you of? Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau were twins. And by the way, there's a saying that twins skip a generation. This might be biblical precedence for it. Because Jacob was a twin and then his sons, but then now it skipped a generation. In all seriousness, I think that the similarity is meant to be drawn in more ways than just one. So Perez and Zerah are twins in the womb, but notice that the first one comes out, his hand comes out, and a scarlet thread is tied on his hand, saying that he came out first. He was the firstborn. Scarlet was a bright and vivid color. As I understand, it was difficult and expensive to make, and usually denoted royalty. And so, what I think is being said by this scarlet thread is this one is going to receive the rights of being firstborn. But he draws back his hand, and his brother comes out, and it said, what a breach you have made for himself. His name was named Perez. Perez means breaking through or breach or even an outburst. This word is used later in 1 Samuel, when David is, or 2 Samuel, when David is bringing in the ark, and Uzzah touches the ark, and God strikes him, and David is angry about that. He calls that place Perez Uzzah, outburst against Uzzah. So that's the idea of the name Perez here. It's kind of a violent breaking forth. But what I think is going on here is something that has gone on throughout Genesis and will continue to go on, a theme that has showed itself time and time again, where seemingly the firstborn is overthrown by someone else. It actually happened with Isaac and Ishmael, though we don't talk about that one as much. Ishmael was the firstborn by Abraham, but he was not the child of promise. That was Isaac. Isaac was his son by Sarah, and the one who God chose to be the heir of the promise, though Ishmael typically would have had a legal claim to being the firstborn. But then Jacob and Esau come along, and we know that story, that Esau sells his birthright to Jacob, that Jacob steals the blessing for himself by deceiving his father, and so Jacob overthrows Esau and receives the promises, the blessing, atypical of how the culture used to go. It seems as God is almost doing the same here with Perez and Zerah. Zerah, by the way, his name means bright or brilliant. Maybe thought to be having to do with the scarlet thread that was tied around his wrist. But you know whose name ends up being significant in the grand scheme of things? We learn this much later on. But it is through the line of Perez that comes King David, King Solomon, the kings of Judah, and eventually Jesus. The ruling line came through Judah's second-born, the second-born of Judah and Tamar here. It did not go to Zerah. And so this seems to be another case where God is upsetting the established order and using whomever He chooses in order to continue on with the kingly line of Judah and the promises therein. As we close talking about Genesis chapter 38 this evening, I want to talk about a concept that we've visited before, but it's come back. You remember when we talked about Lot, and we talked about how his decisions that for where he lived impacted his faith. Well, I think that happens to Judah here. Instead of staying with his family, he goes out among the godless people of Canaan. He takes a wife from the godless people of Canaan. His sons become evil, yes, but Judah himself was influenced by that evil. He did evil things. He was not righteous. So much so that a daughter-in-law who played the harlot with her own father-in-law was more righteous than him. At least that's what Judah said. Judah has strayed from what God has wanted for Jacob and his family. And it all started with separating himself from his brothers. The point I want to make from that is when we make our life decisions, we need to factor in, is this going to make me stronger in my relationship with God, or is it going to weaken me? Judah made decisions that were clearly already should have been known were going to weaken his faith and weaken his morals. It happened with Esau. It happened with everyone else who's done it. It was probably told him by Jacob not to marry a Canaanite, but he did it anyway. And so for us, we have to ask ourselves, are we doing things that we know are not going to strengthen our faith, but rather weaken them? And that could be in a multitude of different ways. Where we live, what our jobs are, where we send our children to school, or whether we send them to school, and so on and so forth. There are so many decisions that we make in life, and I would wager that a lot of them, maybe even all of them, have an impact on our relationship with God as far as whether it'll strengthen it or weaken it. This evening, I'd like to, if you have not obeyed the gospel, that invitation remains open. It is always open. But this time in particular is a time to think about where your relationship with God stands. If you're not a Christian, you can obey the gospel this evening. If you are a Christian and need to make things right with God, this is a perfect time to do so. If you have any need this evening, won't you come while we stand and sing?